It was the summer of 1977 in Enfield, a quiet working-class suburb of London. The Hodgson family lived in a modest council house on Green Street, a place that looked unremarkable on the outside. But within those walls, something would unfold that would become one of the most infamous hauntings in modern history. One night, 11-year-old Janet Hodgson sat up in her bed, startled awake by the sound of knocking. It wasn't the sound of her siblings moving about, nor was it the wind rattling the old windows. This knocking came in a rhythm, sharp, deliberate, and coming from the walls themselves. She turned to her sister Margaret, who was sharing the room with her. Margaret heard it too. And then, without warning, the heavy chest of drawers against the wall shuddered, scraped forward across the floor and inched toward the door. Both girls screamed. Their mother, Peggy, rushed in, only to see the piece of furniture move again, slowly but surely, as if an invisible hand were pushing it. Peggy shouted at the children to stop playing tricks, but the look on their faces told her they were as terrified as she was. When Peggy tried to push the chest back into place, she felt something she could not explain, as though the air itself resisted her, thick and heavy, forcing against her arms. The more she pushed, the more she realized. It wasn't her children moving the furniture. It was something else. That night marked the beginning of a torment that would last for nearly 2 years. Before we uncover the chilling details, tell me this. What time and country are you watching from right now? I'd love to know where our Haunted History family gathers from. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more long-form horror history for sleep, where we travel through the world's darkest hauntings together. The first days of the haunting were almost subtle. Knocks on the walls, footsteps when no one was there, toys tossed across the floor. But soon, the activity escalated beyond denial. Peggy Hodgson, a single mother of 4, was exhausted, stretched thin between work and caring for her children. She wanted to believe her daughters were simply imagining things, but when neighbors began to hear the sounds too, loud, violent knocks that shook the walls of the small house, Peggy knew something unnatural was happening. The children described voices calling out to them from the darkness, muttering their names in the middle of the night. Cold drafts swept through their rooms, though the windows were shut tight. And then came the moments that would forever cement Enfield into paranormal history, the levitations. On one particularly terrifying night, Janet awoke to find herself being dragged across the bed. She clutched the sheets, screaming for her sister. Margaret barely had time to react before she saw her younger sibling lift off the mattress, suspended in the air as though invisible hands had gripped her. Janet's body arched, her hair floating, her mouth frozen in a scream that barely formed sound. When Peggy and neighbors burst into the room, they saw what they would never forget. Janet hovering above her bed, her limbs rigid and her eyes wide in terror, before she was violently flung onto the floor. The question that tormented them all was simple, yet unanswerable. What force had entered their home, and why had it chosen Janet? And worse, if this was only the beginning, what horrors still lay ahead for the Hodgson family? Section 2, The Voices and the Possession. By the autumn of 1977, the Hodgson household had become a war zone between the living and the unseen. The strange activity escalated each night. Furniture dragged across the floor, toys hurled with impossible force, doors slamming as if by an angry hand. But all of it seemed to center around Janet Hodgson. It wasn't just levitations anymore. It was into just being tossed from her bed or finding herself pinned to the mattress by an invisible weight. Janet began to change. Neighbors reported hearing her speak in a voice that wasn't her own. Deep, guttural, raspy, and chillingly old. At first, Peggy thought her daughter was playing a prank, but the sound that emerged from Janet's throat was impossible for an 11-year-old girl to produce. During one terrifying night, as the family huddled together in fear, the voice introduced itself. It claimed to be a man named Bill Wilkins, a former resident of the house. Through Janet, he declared, "I died in this chair in the corner after I went blind." The voice was so raw and haunting that even the most skeptical neighbors were shaken. Peggy knew her daughter was not a skilled ventriloquist. She was too young, too frightened, too exhausted. Yet the voice persisted, holding conversations for hours at a time, answering questions Janet could never have known. The longer this entity spoke, the weaker Janet seemed to become. Her eyes would glaze over, her body slack, as though the voice drained her energy with each word. Word of the haunting spread beyond Enfield, drawing the attention of the Society for Psychical Research. Investigators Maurice Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair arrived at the Hodgson home, determined to uncover the truth. What they witnessed would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The investigators recorded hours of tapes of Janet speaking in the deep male voice. Skeptics insisted she was faking it, perhaps speaking in a false register. But medical experts confirmed something far stranger. The voice came from Janet's false vocal cords, a part of the throat rarely used and impossible for most children to sustain. Yet Janet spoke in this demonic growl for hours without strain. Even worse, it wasn't only the voice. Investigators and neighbors began to witness Janet's violent levitations with their own eyes. At times, she was hurled across the room like a rag doll. At others, she was seen rising into the air, contorting in unnatural shapes. On one occasion, a policewoman herself signed a statement confirming she saw a chair lift off the ground and slide several feet on its own. The Enfield house had become a spectacle. Journalists from across London crowded outside. Paranormal researchers set up cameras, tape recorders, and notebooks. The Hodgsons, however, couldn't leave. They had no choice but to endure the nightly torment. For Janet, the possession deepened. She would wake up with her body twisted, her limbs tied in impossible knots by bedsheets. She claimed hands gripped her throat at night, choking her awake. And always, that voice returned, mocking, laughing, reminding the family that they were powerless. And here's where things get darker. Janet was not the only one tormented. Her siblings began to hear the growling, the muttering, the footsteps in the hall. Sometimes the voice spoke to them directly, issuing threats, promising to kill. The haunting no longer belonged to Janet alone. It had consumed the entire household. But the biggest question loomed like a shadow over everyone. Was this truly the spirit of a man named Bill Wilkins? Or something far older, far darker, using his voice as a mask? And if this entity had already taken over Janet's body and voice, how far would it go before claiming her soul completely? Section 3. The Warrens and the World's Attention. By late 1977, the haunting of the Hodgson home was no longer just a local story whispered about on Green Street. It had become a full-blown media sensation. Reporters camped outside the house. Headlines screamed of London's Amityville. Skeptics mocked, believers shivered, and everyone wanted to know, was it real? The Society for Psychical Research had already logged hundreds of hours of evidence. Recordings of the voices, photographs of Janet levitating, first-hand witness accounts of moving furniture. Yet critics dismissed it all as trickery. They said Janet was just a clever girl seeking attention. Some suggested her mother, Peggy, was in on it too. But anyone who had stepped inside the Hodgson house, anyone who had felt the bone-chilling cold in the middle of summer, anyone who had seen chairs lift from the floor or heard the guttural growl in the dead of night, struggled to explain it away. And then, the case drew the attention of Ed and Lorraine Warren, the American paranormal investigators who had already become infamous for their work on the Amityville haunting. When the Warrens arrived in Enfield, they found a family teetering on the edge of collapse. Janet was exhausted, pale and fragile, her body marked with bruises and scratches no one could explain. Peggy was overwhelmed, unable to protect her children from forces she couldn't see. And the younger siblings were terrified, caught between disbelief and sheer terror as the nights grew worse. The Warrens immediately recognized the signs. Lorraine Warren, a clairvoyant, claimed she could sense a dark, oppressive presence clinging to Janet. She warned that what they were dealing with wasn't just a restless ghost, but something much more sinister. A malevolent spirit feeding on fear, perhaps even demonic in nature. The Warrens weren't the only ones to weigh in. The haunting attracted priests, skeptics, parapsychologists, and even stage magicians trying to debunk it. Some pointed to the photographs of Janet levitating, arguing she was simply jumping off the bed. But those who saw her twisted in midair, her body arched unnaturally as though pulled by unseen hands, knew better. And then came the recordings. Hours of Janet's possession captured on tape. In one of the most famous exchanges, the voice of Bill Wilkins spoke through her for more than 2 minutes without pause. Doctors later confirmed no child could produce such a voice for that long without irreparably damaging their throat. Janet walked away unscathed. The tension in the house was unbearable. Nights were the worst. Heavy knocking echoed through the walls. Toys turned into weapons, thrown with impossible strength. Crosses were ripped from the walls. Even the family's beds shook violently, as though the entire house wanted to throw them out. The Warrens insisted that the family needed spiritual intervention, but the Catholic Church was reluctant, skeptical of the reports. Without an official exorcism, the Hodgsons were left to fight night after night, clinging to their sanity as the world outside debated whether they were liars or victims. And here's the most chilling part. Despite all the investigators, despite the evidence, despite the witnesses, the entity never left. If anything, it seemed to feed on the attention. The more people came, the stronger it became. The Warrens believed the Hodgsons were dealing with an inhuman spirit, something that used the mask of Bill Wilkins to trick and confuse, something that could possess Janet, torment her, and perhaps never let her go. But the true terror of the Enfield case wasn't just what happened inside the house. It was what came next, how the hauntings seeped into every aspect of their lives, testing the limits of science, faith, and fear itself. Because what happened to Janet after the Warrens left was darker than anything they had faced before. Section 4, the final terror and lasting legacy. By 1979, the Enfield case had been raging for nearly 2 years. The Hodgson family was exhausted, worn down by constant fear, endless investigators, and nights of violence. Janet, in particular, had become the epicenter of it all. The girl who levitated, who spoke with voices not her own, who became the unwilling host of something beyond human. The darkest nights came when the presence took full control. Janet's voice would drop into that rasping growl, her body twisted and rigid as she screamed words that weren't hers. Sometimes she'd laugh. Not a child's laugh, but something guttural, mocking, as if the entity inside her was amused by the chaos it created. There was one night witnesses would never forget. Janet was seen sliding up the wall of her bedroom, her body pressed flat against it, before being flung across the room like a rag doll. Skeptics insisted it was stagecraft, but the terror on her face in the photographs told another story. The house itself seemed alive. Furniture toppled on its own, curtains twisted as though gripped by invisible hands. A cold presence followed the family no matter where they went. The sound of heavy boots pacing the floor at night drove them to the brink of madness. And yet, as suddenly as it began, the intensity seemed to wane. By 1979, the violent activity lessened, though strange disturbances would still occur sporadically. Janet herself claimed that the entity never truly left. Even as she grew older, she reported feeling watched, haunted by shadows, and whispers she could not escape. Skeptics, of course, remained unconvinced. They pointed to the moments when Janet and her sister were caught bending spoons or deliberately knocking on walls. To them, the Enfield case was nothing more than an elaborate hoax, a desperate family seeking attention. But those who experienced it firsthand, including police officers, reporters, and paranormal investigators, swore that no human trickery could explain what they saw. A chair sliding across the floor on its own, objects flying with impossible force, voices emerging from Janet's throat while her lips remained sealed. Ed and Lorraine Warren continued to insist that what plagued the Hodgsons was real, a powerful, malevolent force, perhaps even demonic in origin. And Lorraine, until her death, would describe Enfield as one of the most terrifying cases of her career. To this day, the Enfield Poltergeist remains one of the most documented hauntings in history. More than 30 people witnessed events that defied explanation. Hundreds of hours of recordings exist. Photographs of Janet in midair, tapes of voices no child could produce. The evidence endures, even as the debate rages on. Was it a hoax? Was it mass hysteria? Or was it proof that something truly inhuman walked among us, hiding in the shadows of an ordinary London home? The haunting of Green Street never delivered a neat ending. No priest banished the spirit. No exorcism closed the door. Instead, the Hodgsons were left with a scar that time could never fully heal. Janet herself later admitted that some incidents were exaggerated, but she also swore that most of what happened was true, and that the entity inside her was real. The Conjuring 2 turned the Enfield case into Hollywood horror, but the reality was darker, messier, and far more unsettling than any film could portray. So tonight, as you drift to sleep with the sound of rain around you, remember this: the Enfield poltergeist may have been debated, dissected, and doubted, but some doors once opened are never fully closed, and some voices once heard never truly go silent.